there are so many different readings of this book that you should know none of them is privileged. I should stress that the reason that this book is a great book on consciousness is that your reading of it is the most important one. And that's not to say that you shouldn't read around it and see what others have said about it, but what the book reveals about you is hidden within your reading of it. So Findlay, that we're going to read the foreword from, he is offering a reading of this book, and I'm going to be more specific. He offers a reading which stresses the necessity but not uniqueness of the steps which consciousness takes. So he says the way you should read the phenomenology is by focusing on how self-consciousness develops and how representations in your mind follow one another, how from one idea you get to the next idea. That's the reading that he gives.
Yeah, and the main part is that these steps themselves are inherently contingent, and contingent is not the same as necessary. So when Hegel is outlining the steps in the development of consciousness, keep in mind that he's talking about the past to the present moment. He doesn't say that future man will have these same developments and steps into absolute spirit, because he claims that the philosopher is the son of the times. So he's very much embedded within this idea that it's from the past till now. It's not the only path that could have been taken in the development of world spirit, but it's one of the paths that could have been taken in the development of world spirit.
Yeah, I would. So I actually agree with Findlay's reading. I think that this translation is actually really good, and the obviously the foreword is really good. But there's others. There's other translations. For example, Jean Hippolyte.
I have, of course, the famous Georgetown professor Terry Pinkert, who recently retired, who also offers a very nice and digestible reading of Hegel. When it comes to an accompanying guide to this text, I think we'll be using this one just because it helps translate some of the more difficult ideas into English. Even though this book is in English that we're reading right now, it might not seem like it's English. But
yeah, German as a language is actually kind of important to Hegel's thinking. I think he talks a little bit about it in The Science of Logic, which is the next book, which gets me onto the point that this foreword also makes the point that the phenomenology is a stepping stone for the science of logic. Yeah. So you should read the phenomenology as a sort of thing that will really like get you into the science of logic. I don't think that's necessarily correct. I think the phenomenology can stand on its own very strongly, having read both.
Yeah.
It's just worth it for its own sake. It's excellent. A few things is Hippolyte's reading really focuses on the historical development of the idea, and that's a reading which you will notice is very prevalent in late 20th century continentals. Foucault, Deleuze, they take a little bit of Hegel that they sort of comment on, and it's mostly Hippolyte's reading on it. Yeah. And we should stress there's others. Heidegger has a reading on Hegel, which is about
Heidegger also sees the Hegelian position in the fact that it was written in German as like a privileged thing. Heidegger even says that like the only language for philosophy to be written in is in fact German, which is a very like, I don't know, maybe a pseudo-pragmatist position by Heidegger itself, but he makes a very important claim in saying that like it might be slightly complicated as an English reader to try to understand and distinguish, and this is also a very Hegelian point, the way in which preconceived categories apply to language itself. Like in the development of world spirit towards a final science, for example, science as we understand it in English is not the same science as we understand in German, namely Wissenschaft, which means something completely different to the English version of what science is, as Petko pointed out.
Yeah, and Findlay's self-aware in the text. You'll see he says, the same effort that we expound to read Shakespeare, Mallarmé, who are literary titans and are not necessarily considered these um, uh, form formal philosophers with the structure that Hegel is constantly praised for. That effort should actually be applied also to Hegel. And I really, I my reading, for example, is that this book is very stream of consciousness. It's not structured the way that most contemporaries would claim, like point one, point two, like the geometrical series that you would encounter in Leibniz. This
Yeah.
book, quite literally, it should be almost a meditation, because you're immersing yourself in Hegel's mind. He will literally allow you to drink from the fountain of his internal um, monologue. And when I say monologue, I mean the dialectic. The dialectic is a word from all the way to Greek philosophy. It's literally the dialogue taken as a whole. Um, so there's a dialectic between Plato and Socrates,
And
or
if
between Parmenides and
I would just
um,
add that while Petko is right in saying that like Hegel is very much a stream of consciousness kind of writing, keep in mind that Hegel does try to seem to stay to some sort of logic within the text itself. So you can see almost a battle between this idea of expressing his own consciousness and the unfolding of his consciousness. And Finlay does a really good job at talking about what personal influences were there for Hegel as well. Like he talks about like there's this weird section in which it talks about the importance of having a sister, for example. And it's like this is something that's very clearly Hegelian because Hegel was very much very close with his sister. Anyway, the whole point is to say that like, while it's a stream of consciousness and it's definitely a meditation, the easiest trick to reading a text as complicated as a phenomenology is to try to keep it in mind that it does follow some similar like think about it like a leitmotif in music, kind of the same. It's going to be repeated over and over again, the structure of it, whether the contents of the melody will be different, the rhythmic structure of whatever is being played will try to be maintained in some certain, have some certain, what's it called? Like
yeah,
it follows like a one, two, three pattern, essentially in the sense
the
that like,
underlying pattern.
yeah,
That's precisely the big question that I was getting onto, is what is the dialectic? That's what it is. It's that rhythm. Nowhere in the book does Hegel stop and say, oh, okay, let's define what the dialectic is. It is the process that you go through as you read the book. It is not something that you will find in the book, but between each line. And it's about the internalization of externalities, because that's what the phenomenology is. It is, how does the world outside of your head appear in your head? And the same thing which happens when you are sort of talking to yourself, and there's two sides, as in there's a dialogue, um, which usually is an external thing, the dialogue between, uh, you know, Heraclitus, Parmenides. If you internalize it, it's you with you. That's the dialectic. It's that, but about everything, not about just dialogues. It's also about shapes, space, time, being, non-being, and so on. It's about how do these things appear in your head, and it's a process. That's the most important thing. Is the dialectic is a process. It's not an essence. An essence being something that you can access automatically and realize, uh, like a platonic object, right? You can picture a triangle. You can't picture a dialectic. Um, you can only sort of live through it.
yeah. And one of the really nice interpretations by Finlay here is that he offers the phenomenology. He speaks about it in the possessive term, we, the phenomenologists. So Petko was right in saying at the beginning that it's a journey, because in that sense, you're accompanying Hegel into his own development of consciousness, the development of world consciousness, and your own at the same time. But I think it would be nice before we jump into this phenomenology of spirit to take a moment and talk a little bit about Kant and what it is exactly that Hegel is replying to. And at that time, in the time where Hegel was writing it and before, there it was this concept of an abstract absolute that was somehow dominating everything. And we'll go down to it more in the text. This idea that there exists an underlying ultimate reality that explains everything. This is a very like Schelling kind of position. And this is kind of one of the things that Hegel wants to counter because it's very much in the same way that Horkheimer with the Frankfurt School criticizes the idea of Verklärung, this idea that German idealism takes concepts to be outside in this transcendental realm, inaccessible to those, and only merely accessible through what would appear phenomena. And Petko, you can back me up on your opinion on what Hegel is doing here, but one of the main things is that it's not just a response to German ideology, German idealism in its genealogy as a whole, namely with the abstract absolute, but it's also primarily a response to Kant and the very Kantian idea where this concept of having transcendental categories in which the mind can only experience the things in front of themselves, never the thing in itself, poses the question for Hegel, well, why can we not access the thing in itself as a whole? Why do we have to limit rationality into these bounds where it is only through the phenomenal realm that can be experienced? And this is exactly what Hegel wants to talk about. He wants to say that there exists something that is intrinsically humanly graspable about an absolute.
Yeah, precisely. This is a direct rebuttal of that idea that the noumenon is inaccessible from the phenomenon. And the running point is that this undermines itself, that Hegel will show that this idea that one is inaccessible is also in the phenomenon. It's a phenomenological thought. And the move that happens within Hegel, the sublation, essentially, is to say, well, that self-negation of this idea is part of the absolute. So when you say that you cannot access the thing in itself through phenomenology, you do so through phenomenology. And now that negation of a negation is something positive, something which exists in itself. And immediately you're back to something which starts looking more like a more accessible externality than an internality. And that's sort of the process that we're going to be tracking with the dialectic.
Yeah. So I'm very happy that we gave this nice and very clear, very well put, like precursor to what Hegel's replying to. Are there any questions so far before we jump in and like look at the text a little bit more in depth? All right, great. So it was published twice. The first time it was published in 1807, as it says here, and it was republished, in which Hegel did not want to include, what's it called? He didn't want to include any additional comments on it because he said that the Phenomenology of Spirit is a four-piece, and this is exactly what he says here. It's a four-piece that can be dropped and discarded once the student, through deep immersion of its contents, has advanced the confusions and misunderstanding to the properly philosophical point of view. So I do agree with Petko that maybe Finlay's reading is a little bit too narrow in the sense that it cannot stand by itself and then must have somehow be taken and adapted to like the philosophies of science or his later works, for example. But essentially, it's almost like a guidebook for the student. And he puts it very well here. Its task is to run through, in a scientifically purged order, the stages in the mind's necessary progress from immediate sense consciousness to the position of a scientific philosophy. So, in one sentence, he defines the entire task of what the phenomenology of spirit is. It's in a very rigorous scientific way. And scientific, we don't mean like the scientific method and how it would be interpreted there, but it's the stages of mind's necessary progress. So note the term necessary here does not mean necessary in the sense of this is the only steps the mind could have taken, but this progress itself is necessary. From immediate sense consciousness, which would be, as we know it, the senses, to the position of a scientific, as I explained earlier, Wissenschaft philosophy, showing thereby that this position is the only one the mind can take when it comes to the end of the intellectual and spiritual adventures. And he's very right to put the term adventures described in the book. Then he talks a little bit briefly, let's see, yeah, he didn't want a republication. Yes, so this is what we're talking about now, about how he didn't want to revise it because at the time it was replying to what an abstract, absolute dominated philosophy. And I wish they included this paragraph from Hausweis's appendix, but that's essentially what we talked about with this lineage of Kant, Fichte, Schelling to Hegel, this idea of an abstract, absolute, this German idealism concept, that ultimate reality that explains everything. And in this sense, it does appear somewhat in a different form in Hegel through the unfolding of absolute spirit. So if we keep going down the forward, he did not think it's the only possible necessary sequence or pathway to science. This is as Petko outlined earlier, and certainly not the pathway to science that would be taken by men in the future, or that might have been taken in other cultural and historical settings. So here he's already bringing the concept of contingency, this idea that whatever had to happen has happened until now, precisely due to the history of what had to unfold. And this is like, I don't know, the other universe hypothesis for Hegel is that it could very well have taken a different form in other ways. And this is why Hegel's going to jump around with a lot of like historical terms as well. He's going to be referencing different types of Christianity. He's going to be referencing wars. He's going to be referencing a lot of like cultural developments, because for him, everything is an interrelated hot pot that produces these develops in consciousness. So I was going to mention a point, but we're going to bring it down. Yeah, so it's not the only path. He also claims here, Finlay, that he tries to explain, and I think Petko did a better job than Finlay, in explaining what the dialectic method is. He offers a very poor definition, in my opinion, by claiming and comparing it to somehow this almost mathematical sense. And like it is mathematical in the sense that it follows a logical structure, but it's a lot richer than math. He says here, dialectic is in fact a richer and more supple form of thought advance and mathematical inference. For while the latter proceeds on lines of strict identity, this would be your classic Pythagorean forms of reasoning, of shapes, etc., adducing only what is explicit or almost explicit, the dialectic always makes higher order comments upon its various thought positions, stating relations that carry us far beyond their obvious content. So what he's saying is that the math takes very much the positive definitions of things, whereas a dialectic can always assume an implicit position within its own development. What is obvious, for example, in being is not its identity with nothing. So this will be referencing a later point that we will read, and I won't explain too much now, but this Hegelian difference between absolute, so being and absolute nothing, which in their opposition produces an obvious and necessary synthesis. And he says, what the obvious and certainty is not its total lack of determinate. So what he's saying is that in being itself, it's not obvious that there's an identity with nothing. And what's obvious in sense certainty and the fact that we have senses is also not the fact that there's a total lack of determinates or determinateness itself. If mathematical identities can thus follow different routes to the same or different goals, dialectical commentaries can even more obviously do the same. So if you want to add anything up to now, Petko, if not, we can continue.
Yeah, obviously this is there's a heavy part, you know. He goes into the dialectic and obviously even mentions in passing some of the examples. So literally, I'm addressing you guys. the first time readers, or if you're confused, you should be, because none of that has like been explained. This is stuff that will come after. So don't worry if you like don't understand what the
Being
syntheses,
yeah.
being in nothing, consciousness to self-consciousness, and so on. It's literally coming in like first chapter.
Yeah.
And I think here, there is the characterization does mention one of the important parts, which is to elevate the perspective from which you start in this process of the dialectic. When you negate things, you kind of jump on top of them. And that's important because it shows that Findlay has a slightly better reading than most others. There's the Fichtean thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That's not the dialectic. It's a very common conflation. The dialectic does not resolve external paradoxes. The dialectic resolves internal tensions of the concept itself. The thing that is in your head as a concept comes with baggage, and you specifically concentrate on which parts of those are too heavy for the concept itself, such that in it implicitly exists something other than it. Because in Hegel's conception, this is very important, practically everything starts off as contingent. Nothing is necessarily what it is. That's the sort of point of the starting point, right? Before you get to anything, absolute. Everything can be other than it is. And specifically, we're interested in what those things are.
Yeah, and he says here, it represents a track that the mind may or may not take, or that it may or may not prefer to other tracks on its journey to a given conclusion. There is no reason then to think that Hegel thought that the path traced in the Phenomenology, though consisting of necessary steps, was the only path that the conscious spirit would have taken in rising from sensory immunity to absolute knowledge. It was the path that had been taken by the world spirit. So here we encounter another Hegelian term, the world spirit. I think for now, it might be better to not define world spirit in its entirety, but just keep in mind that it's something that is of teleological responsibility for the process of self-developing, self-becoming of consciousness itself. And I think, Petko, you might, if you disagree with me, if you want to give a definition now, but I think it might be even better to read Hegel without having a pre-existing definition of what the world spirit might be, because it prevents the reader
it's better. You can think of the world spirit, but he only touches on it towards the end of the book, and then continues developing that in Science of Logic. So we won't really even get to the elaboration of the world spirit here. Obviously, it will come up, but nowhere near the start. A lot of things will need to be developed before you can actually develop the world spirit, and the world spirit is this messy idea which was taken by Heidegger, and it's interpreted in different ways itself. The reading which I would give it, the most succinct one that I think is somewhat elaborative for here, for the starting point, is the world spirit is self-consciousness of the absolute itself. Not particularly in the woo sense in which we humans are the universe, experiencing itself and so on. Everything is connected. It's not about that. It's about the progression which is set out, and that progression being positive instead of arbitrary. As in, world spirit is a vague direction which we're going to be following.
So yeah, he also develops this, and I like that I think we're going to continue this series. Obviously, and if it's going to be Hegel series, we're going to continue with the science of logic and maybe even like lectures on aesthetics at the same time because it might be nice to read them together. But he talks about in the preface to the philosophy of right, and this is the thing that I mentioned about Hegel not going beyond the bounds of his own knowledge, or almost in a very Kantian sense, he recognizes the knowledge that reason, like the limits that reason can hit. He says that the philosopher is necessarily a son of his own time, and that philosophy and his philosophy is that time comprehended in thought. So the idea to like transcend one's time, to go beyond and offer, some sort of explanation, he says to venture the soft elements, the elements of fancy and opinion. So anyway, Finlay is really hammering down on this point that it's not the only path that could have been taken. It's one path, and it's
Yeah, I, I'm glad that you draw attention to this one. This is, I've sometimes called this book meditative reading. It isn't meditation in like the common sense in terms of, oh, read this to relax, to calm down or something like that. No, because meditation is all about mindfulness, and mindfulness is about being in the present. Hegel is the philosopher of present, as in, what the hell is this paradoxical moment sandwiched between a past and a future, which is so fleeting and yet you can never escape it. It's that, and um, when he says that he's not going to fancy into speculative analyses of where this will lead and stuff. That's precisely what makes it timeless, because he only focused on the present and the here and now, the existentialist, or the phenomenological being of consciousness. No matter like whether a human is born 200,000 years ago or now, we've got the same brain. So the experience of being um something of that nature will stay the same.
yeah. But enough about Finlay's sort of all different paths are possible. Finlay also really stresses that yes, whilst there's a multiplicity of different, like a very Doctor Strange kind of like there's infinite scenarios that could have happened. There's one thing or like multiple things that Hegel wants to stress, that though much that is contingent historical and breaks not like and refuses to break wholly loose from this, his concern is with the Begriffe, or the universal notional shapes. So what are the Begriffe? So the Begriffe are universal structures that pass through history as these sort of all-inclusive universals. The Begriffe, however, are not the same thing as the absolute of totality. So these are two things that are entirely different. The Begriffe themselves are universal structures. And I will talk more about what this all-inclusive universal of what any universal is. So I think it's on the next page. Hegel says the universal is no strengthless arbitrary distillation of the common features of what is individual and empirical. So if we take that sentence, imagine a scenario in which, I don't know, you look at trees outside and you notice that each tree has, branches, leaves, it has a brownish color of a trunk, whatever, like, I don't know, that has birds in it, and you determine based on these individual empirical notions that this bigger concept of tree comes from that. Hegel's saying it's reversal. He's saying this essence of tree-ness, of what a tree is, applies itself as a category of existence before any sort of empirical responsibility that the human has to take it into consideration. So he says it's what must be conceived as realizing itself in what is individual and empirical. And of course, I use a very simple example, and I mentioned trees, which Hegel will also talk about natural phenomena. However, this is to be applied more in the sense of like greater words, like humanity, for example. Is humanity something that is empirically observable in different stages of being, or is humanity something that, again, like Petko says, applies itself before the human being? And if you want to add
Yeah,
anything to that.
that's that's his whole, that a really really good emphasis. His whole point is that um, abstract categories of things are not so abstract that they are inaccessible to us. Um, and that is, uh, you know, specifically, you go back to Plato. Um, Abstractness was considered to be the way to access the thing in itself. Um, so the essence of a circle could only, imperfectly be um, instantiated in the world around you, but you, as a thinking philosophical subject, are able to find this immaterial abstract concept, which is the perfect essence of a thing. And for Kant, what why Kant is so important is because, um, uh, as Whitehead said, all philosophy is footnotes to Plato. He's where we really start to try and refute that. He says that we have actually no such axis in the strong terms that Plato insisted, and um, uh, Hegel was one of the first people to really turn everything on its head, as opposed to um, just sort of add a footnote, so to speak. For him, it's not all about um, perfect forms, but about constantly changing forms within categories. He treats um, ideas like self-consciousness, um, quantum, uh, a a spirit, as equally uh, imminent to the world as Plato would treat a triangle and a circle and a square, right? Just more complicated, but on the same status of um, uh, sort of real things. It's uh, it's really like when people call Hegel an idealist, it's like he would say that those ideas are real things, um, which uh, you can sort of derive almost.
Deleuze would
We'll
have
see him try
loved
to do that.
Deleuze would have loved Hegel for his for his anti-Oedipus,
Yeah, I mean, right.
the ultimate schizophrenic.
The Zizekian rebuttal was that Deleuze was implicitly a Hegelian all along.
Yeah. But yeah, no, it sums up perfectly. This is a great transition back to the text. He says here that the universal doesn't necessarily align itself with what is contiguous in space and history. So this is things like spirit, like what Petko mentioned. And hence in the phenomenology, the conceptual treatment can jump wildly from one factual empirical scene to the other. For example, from the scientific universals behind phenomena to the fellow minds, which discover them in phenomena, blah, blah, blah. So he's going to jump around from the Stoics to the skeptics to Plato, who entrench themselves in cogitative abstraction from contingent content, to the medieval devotees who located their explanatory abstractions beyond all such content. So, yeah, that's like the summary of this section. He jumps into this next thing of saying that, like, phenomenology and how we should understand phenomenology, because there's going to be plenty of definitions of phenomenology that come after with Husserl, with Heidegger, but essentially phenomenology is how things appear to consciousness. That's like the end of phenomenology in a very baby down watered kind of definition. Um, so because it's this very abstract thing, Hegel sees that these developments of phenomenological stages, he considers them a logical growth out of notions out of other notions. So the reason why this text is hard to read and why a lot of universities don't give like page 250 from 256 to read is because you're essentially following a history of thought. So you can't just pick up the book from the middle and read it like without having done your necessary due diligence and gone through the former stages themselves. Of course you can, and you're welcome to, but it might be very difficult to do so. So let's see if there's anything important here. Yes, he says, it is we, the phenomenological students of the shapes of spirit, who see the logical connection between them. So Finlay is actually saying that this development of conscious thought that happened is not directly accessible or was not directly accessible or not even realized by the kingdom of subjects who consider this nature. And he says that he has this very privileged position in saying that like once reading the phenomenology together and embarking on this adventure, that's when we start to see the shapes of spirit. And even though there was a logical progression in how the mind had developed, that is not the same as the project of the phenomenology of spirit, which is to undergo the journey as a whole. So he's basically saying that people in history didn't really know what was going on. The phenomenology of spirit is the right way of reading it and accessing it. It's important, therefore, that from the very beginnings we frame viable conceptions of the logical movements, right? So keep in mind that these are movements. Our notional shapes of spirit must undergo. Again, term must, because it's a progression, it's a lineage. Subjectively, of course, we have said all these movements involve a species of reflection. So this goes back to Petko's point on the dialectic, that it's this conversation that you have with yourself to achieve a higher order of consciousness. So yes, thought phase, but it's minutes because content. Let me see what else is important here. Petko, if you want to fill in while I find the next page and what's important.
Yeah, it's good that we also mentioned Deleuze in passing, because Deleuze's reading of Hegel is quite obviously ontological, and he also follows a bit from Nietzsche in that we need to rebuke Hegel and his radical negativity. So here in the foreword, we also have this process of negation being discussed a little bit. And the mantra, right, for Hegelians is that for Hegel, negation is productive, because negating the negation, like two minuses in a maths equation, gives a plus. That's the basic reading. But for people who have read Deleuze and Nietzsche specifically, they will really be slightly skeptical of negation or this negative process, because affirmation is where these two more recent philosophies dig their feet into the sand, right? Affirmation is very important, self-difference, affirming that. The way that I reconcile these, or the way that you can look at the text, is that Deleuze's reading specifically is very ontological. So in a sense, he looks at the text and is like, because this applies not only to my self-consciousness, but to the world spirit, as in all self-consciousness in the world, so to speak, it's kind of like about the world itself and what there is in the world. And that's why I don't think that negation is relevant there. But negation is relevant when you are abstracting yourself from the world, because you are immanent to the world. You and your self-consciousness, you are part of the world. There's no Descartesian split between spirit and whatnot. That's what Hegel is trying to he's trying to situate you in the world. That's the only ontology that he's really touching. For Hegel, negation is a process of phenomenology. As in, when you see the world, the primary thing which you do is negate a literal multiplicity of possibilities. When you are looking at the text, you completely abstract from the pixels on the screen, from the little hairs that are pactified together into your book, um, into the background of the table or everything. You are completely immersed in the singularity of the thing which your mind does. And that is precisely the opposite of the outside world. The outside world is this radical affirmative um, uh, multiplicity where everything exists simultaneously. But you yourself, the character of consciousness, is negative in that you have to ignore all that and singularly present to your own self one aspect of this multiple reality. So I totally agree with Deleuze that ontology is multiplicity, and with Badiou and Nietzsche for that matter. But it's a misreading of Hegel to say that you rebut his negative process by affirming affirmation, because he is from the inside out, whereas the later philosophers are going from outside in. The phenomenology is negative, and that comes later in Badiou in Logics of Worlds. Um, Even though ontology is positive. So yes, it's not as simple as in Hegel negation is always positive or productive. There's a little more nuance there, but that's what we're talking about.
And that's the beauty of Lacan as well, and that's why Lacan is such a Hegelian, is because even though Lacan is doing something that is so inherently, as a science, so oriented from the eye from the beginning, introducing things like the symbolic into the sphere of of the unconscious, is exactly this Hegelian movement of like the outside in reconciling with the inside out. So it's this beautiful Lacan kind of like marries Hegel with like the phenomenologists like Merleau-Ponty and Husserl, things like that, by reconciling the two in some sense or form. But to move on, and this is why I love that I'm doing this with Petko, is because while he explains some concepts, I can jump to the next part in the text and locate it. If we're going to be looking at the phenomenology of spirit as this logical movement, we have to define what this logical movement is and what it means for Hegel. It's not like the dialectic was a good example, but the big picture is that, as Petko mentioned earlier, there's a concept. And the concept itself has within it some inherent contradictions. A reflection of these contradictions reveals yet another more totalized contradiction to that original concept. So you have the concept, because of its own inability to stand by itself, you are revealed to a contradiction towards it. Between the two, you reconcile it and produce a new concept. So this would be this Aufhebung, the new concept that emerges from this contradiction, logical contradiction between A and B. So what Hegel offers are these things called meta-logical explanations, logic about logic itself. So Finlay says here in the text, the logical movement which the phenomenology, like the rest of the system, exhibits is throughout the logic of the side or aspect or moment of that which, while it can be legitimately distinguished in some unity, so this is the idea that it can stand by itself, it must be in fact so distinguished, nevertheless represents something basically incapable of self-sufficiency. So the concept itself cannot stand alone. And independence, properties which can only be attributed to the whole into which sides, aspects, or moments enter, and a reference to which is accordingly built into on each side. On Hegel's basic assumptions, negation, in a wide sense that covers difference, opposition, and reflection of relation, is essential to conception and being. We can conceive nothing and have nothing if we attempt to dispense with it. So again, this concept, the idea of the concept is that it has an inherent self-contradiction, which reveals another contradiction, and this fight between the two sublates the concept that will be taken to its next sphere of consciousness. So if you want to add anything to that, while I look for the next section. Yes. If you want to talk, Petko, about the negation of negation, because this is going to be important before we enter. This is what Finlay calls a second sort of negation. And it's a very bad sentence, in my opinion, because it implies that it's some sort of like second order. to negation as if it's somehow below this original negation. Look at them as the same thing. And if you want to explain what negation of negation is, it's a very important concept that we're going to have to look at.
Yeah, there's so how do I say it?
It's a hard concept to define as well.
It's always it's the good metaphysicians and philosophers always come up with the right movements and the worst examples. So that's why you've got later philosophers sort of giving random examples of that sort of thing. But negation of negation is precisely what pushes things forward, or pushes the thought forward in the phenomenology. It is like a jump, and that jump is on the same level, but has a sort of bird's eye view of the internal contradiction. So the way that this sort of works is when you take the concept itself to its internal logical extreme, you think it through to its end, as I think Hegel puts it in some occasions. Its end is the first negation. It is a self-negation, and precisely, it's almost defeatist of the concept, right? Like this self-defeating of a certain concept is just not an argument, right? It's not a string of characters on a page. It's not what somebody says in elaboration. It is one word, right? You take one word, like self-consciousness with a dash in the middle, and you just try to look into its depth. You almost like unveil it and start digging inside it, see what you find. When you hit hard bedrock and you can't go any further, that's the end. And all of a sudden you can look back at the concept and see that you've sort of excavated it. It's almost it's almost disappearing. And in that moment of complete, annihilation, where you almost completely lose sight of it, it pulls you back violently. That's the second negation. And the second negation is this this radical negation of the self-negation. It is not the first negation relates to the concept itself, and the second negation relates to the concept of that concept through the next one. So the second time you negate, you are already on the other side of the concept, past this logical extreme, and you're looking at it from the imminent next concept, the next stream of consciousness. The thing that comes next is just observing the first negation, and by doing so, it is sustaining the entirety of the concept.
Yeah. So, in a very abstract sense, you can consider the process of becoming almost like sequences in mathematics, in which you have, like, if you take like a quadratic sequence, for example, you have the inherent logic of like 2, 4, 16, like you have that inherent logic. And that is almost like what the arithmetic development is, what Finlay calls it, but it just imagine it in like a non-mathematical sense of what the phenomenology of spirit is. Negation is that second, once you acknowledge the difference between 2, 4, 16, it's that second difference between the 4 and the 16 itself. Like it's that secondary negation once you reach the bedrock of the essence of it. So that's what he calls it, like the development, the test of whose absoluteness, considering the fact that nothing further remains to be taken care of. So that is the end point. That is what we reach. That is absolute knowledge or absolute idea. That's a teleological endness for Hegel. And he has this beautiful thing where he talks about how, like, when, when subject egos recognize each other as all the subject egos, and like this almost we're one with the universe kind of, it reminds me of like those really stupid memes from like 2016 in which, it's like the mind gets elevated to like another plane, and then someone's meditating, and then you zoom out and someone's like controlling the world, and it's like, the stupid memes of like people who brush their teeth in the shower, people who pee and brush their teeth in the shower, like it's those kinds of like developments to higher order levels of consciousness kind of. So in a very stupid sense, because we have to try to keep Hegel funny as well, because we can't just be well high and dry all the time. That's almost how you have to consider it, like there is some sort of finite universal that one reaches at some moment. Yes. So continuing, how's our stamina feeling? Do we want to keep going? Do we not end here? Like have discussions or questions? How are we feeling? Should we finish up until the next page? Because then they talk about the subject or ego. They talk about Hegelian subjectivity. So this is a very important point, like away from the Cartesian sense of thinking it, the subject or ego is thus for Hegel not what we ordinarily understand by as a personal thinker, but the logical function of universality in a particular sort of detachment from its species and instances. So the mind for Hegel, and like it was saying for Aristotle, is just a place of forms, like Petko said, the brain that takes in this multiplicity of information and that is able to go through this Hegelian dialectic process of sublimating it to a further level. There exists a relative independence there, a detachment in the thought ether that they never enjoy elsewhere. So he says that universals for Hegel enjoy sunken implicit existence in natural objects. This is the thing that we were talking about with the essence of a tree. Like the same thing as like the essence of what a dog is. Like, you know what I mean? Like the essence of dogness exists in natural objects. And they also enjoy some sort of being beneath the surface of natural objects as the essences or forces which explain them. He says that also in the logic, they're given a status as pure essentialities or notional shadows without sensuous concretion. So this is referring to those implicit individuals, the particulars that we observe prior to the existence of nature. So this is important. I think it's the most important part of the entire paragraph. And these universal categories, these Begriffe, exist prior to the existence of nature and finite spirit. But however much universals, and the universal of all universals, the idea, may exist apart from subjects, in any ordinary sense of the latter, the fact remains that they achieve their full development and truth in the self-consciousness of spirit. So that's actually a very beautiful phrase by Finlay, and I think it's a great point at which to end our first discussion. And we've done a significant amount of pages, so I'm quite happy. Because the foreword is also quite difficult. It's not easy. So we will continue to read and we'll be a bit more concise. We have to give a lot of background information on the text as well. Are there any questions, or Petko, do you want to add any like final comments?
Yeah, no, I'm really interested in the questions, obviously, because if anybody wants to ask anything, there's no such thing as a stupid question. I mean, there is such a thing as a stupid question, but dialectically, that might be the most genius thing ever
And
because it gets you to learn.
from this Hegelian repositioning, the question is only stupid. Like when we say that there are no stupid questions, there always implicitly exists a stupid question that one can ask. So you can ask the wrong question as well. And while we can pretend it's not the wrong question, it will still be the wrong question. But the whole point of it being the wrong question is that it also brings out certain answers that everyone else can learn from. So there are no bad questions.
Yeah, only stupid ones.
Exactly. Do you guys like the methodology that we go through it? Is it nicer to read close to the text rather than going very abstract? Is that how we should continue from now on? I quite like this like little Plato Socrates little riff that we had going on. It was good. Any comments? No. It's 10:30 p.m. Everyone wants to go to bed. Well, thank you guys for joining, and it's going to be recorded as well. So if you want to watch back on your way to work tomorrow morning, because there's a lot of concepts that we covered, feel free to do so. I'll upload it tonight. But we'll continue with the forward, and I think next week we might try to do it on a different day, just because I'm giving my lecture on phenomenology and Lacan and Badiou next Wednesday, which you guys should more than definitely come for.
Isn't it every 2 weeks, you said?
I was thinking every 2 weeks, but we can see how it goes. Like
Okay.
now that Petko's helping, I think it's going to be a lot easier for me to manage because prior to that, I just don't think I was able to handle the 2 reading groups and like the other lectures that I do and the writing and the editing and the and this on top. But now that Petko's helping, it's completely different actually. So we might try to keep it every single week, also because it might, lend itself to some. So someone mentioned Lacan. Yeah, that's kind of what our institute's about. So every Tuesday we have a Lacan seminar in which I lecture from 6:30. It's every single Tuesday at the Marlin Hotel Waterloo. It's downstairs, meeting rooms 3 and 4. If you join the psychoanalysis chat, it should be there. We've been reading seminar 11, so if you're interested in Lacan, you should definitely join because we've been doing Lacan for the last 6 months and everyone's been loving it. Well, I say everyone's been loving it. I don't know if they've been loving it, but hopefully they've been loving it. And then I'm giving a lecture. I give spontaneous lectures once a month on Lacan, but like specific topics. So the next one that I'm doing is on phenomenology. The one after that is going to be on Badiou, Lacan, and the Impressionist art movement. So if you like art, that's going to be one as well, because I criticize Lacan's definition of impressionism. I'm also really
Everyone's been jouissance Lacan is the correct view. That's what is the loving relationship we've been jouissance practicing.
Yeah, exactly. So Petko's also going to give a talk on Badiou soon. Like I'm a huge Badiousian, which is nice 'cause I found another fellow Badiousian. So I think next month I might be away for a little bit, but towards the end of the month, I'm going to give a talk on love, on Badiou and fidelity. And I think I might try to co-do that with Petko, and then we'll just continue this series. And yeah, so for now, let's say every week now that Petko's helping me. So I'll send out the readings. Let's try to get the forward in as quickly as we can so we can actually jump to the preface, which is going to kill us. So yeah. All right. Well, thank you guys all for joining.
Anybody have questions about the reading, about the phenomenology? Drop them in the chat. If you come up with something while you read the rest of the forward, or you get started on any part, feel free to ask. And it's a forum, so if anybody has ideas on answers, they can get ahead of me or Dragan if they wish. No problem.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
All right. Awesome, guys. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Of course.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, guys.